These last few weeks, we've been exploring several suttas that kind of point towards how our minds work. The first week, we talked a little bit about how our ordinary minds tend to engage in the world, that process of experiencing something and then feeling it, perceiving it, thinking about it, and carrying on from there to identify, proliferate, and then subsequently kind of seeing the world from those perspectives that have been created by our minds. And then last week we talked about how we might begin to watch these processes, see them, see how these processes work, and the experience or the exploration of seeing these processes of work has a very freeing result. It doesn't seem like it would in some ways. The simplicity of the Bahiya Sutta, the teaching where the Buddha offers this simple exploration of just recognize what's happening while it's happening. He says you should train yourself. In reference to the seen, there will be only the seen. In reference to the heard, there will be only the heard. In reference to the sensed, there will be only the sensed. In reference to the cognized, there will be only the cognized. This is how you should train yourself. And at the surface, without unpacking it, without really diving into the meaning of it, it sounds like nothing. It sounds like, so I know I'm angry while I'm angry. What's the big deal? But the perspective that he's pointing to here is not one of the simple knowing. I think we have all known we were angry while we're angry, and we are engaged in that anger. We are not looking at, oh, what is it like to feel a human being that is angry? That's the difference. That's the difference, that perspective of, oh, what is it like to be a human being experiencing seeing, experiencing hearing, experiencing movement, experiencing things happening in our mind? What is it like to be experiencing what is happening while it's happening? And the Honeyball Sutta points to how the process of selfing and papancha enter into the picture. When we see something, we tend to think about it in terms of me, in terms of how it relates to me. And that's our typical way of exploring experience. The Bahiya Sutta encourages us to simply recognize it is experience, including the experience of the sense of self. That too is just another process that can be recognized. And so in the last couple of weeks, we've been exploring some of this. And I think I said last week that I feel like my exploration of the Bahiya Sutta, at least, is not, in practice at least, is not to try to stop things at seeing or hearing, not to try to somehow come in here and like cut things off, but rather to see what is happening, to notice that seeing is happening and that there are thoughts that follow. Then that can be known as, oh, thinking is happening. There's a thought that is arising. If a sense of self is arising, that can be seen. So that's my approach to exploring the Bahiya Sutta as we explore that very simple kind of teaching. We begin to see how our minds are not so simple. And then we can see that. The seeing of it begins to simplify it. So tonight I'd like to talk about kind of further about the mind of freedom, this third sutta that I put in that was in the handouts. And again, I will put the link here in the chat for, in case you don't have them nearby or something. In this document that I just put into the chat is a list of the links for the 3 handouts. And I added another one last week, so there's 4 handouts. So the one we're talking about today, the Kalakarama Sutta, you're welcome to bring it up and follow along there if you like. I may highlight some things on the screen by sharing, but I actually kind of wanted to approach things in a little bit more meditative way today instead of quite so much of an intellectual way. So there's a couple of different, there's a lot of different places where in the suttas, there's explorations of what the mind of freedom is like. And one particular one that I like comes from a collection of poems. This is not in the handouts. A collection of poems in the Sutta Nipata called the Atthakavagga. And that collection of poems, it's understood to be kind of very old teachings. They're maybe some of the first few teachings that were actually kind of codified by the Buddha or kind of remembered. There are places in the sutta where in the texts where it actually refers to these teachings. It says, do you remember that teaching, the Atthakavagga? Do you have that one memorized? And it was actually encouraged to memorize this set of poems. So this set of teachings has, it's structured. There's 16 poems, and there are different aspects in each of the poems, but each of the poems kind of falls into one of three categories. They either talk about our minds in their ordinary ways, what it's like for our ordinary minds being caught in craving and struggle and stress. So there's some poems that with that flavor. And then there's some poems with the flavor of what is it like to have a mind that is free? What is it like to be that kind of a person? And then there are a set of poems that talk about how one might get from one to the other. So a set of teachings, a set of poems about the path of practice. The one I'd like to share just a few verses from tonight is from one of those poems that describe someone who is free. And it's a different perspective than the Kalakarama Sutta. This perspective, I'll just let it speak for itself, and then we'll talk about it after I read it. So in this poem, someone comes to the Buddha and asks him to describe someone who is free or peaceful. And the Buddha responds. So here are the verses. Here's the questioner. Having what vision, being of what character, is one called peaceful? Gautama, tell me about the Supreme Person. And the Buddha responds, a person who is not angered, not frightened, not boastful, not fretful, who gives wise advice, who is calm, restrained in speech, who is indeed a sage. A person who is not attached to the future, who does not sorrow over the past, who finds solitude amidst sense contact, and is not guided by fixed views. A person who is retiring, not deceitful, not covetous, not greedy, not impudent, not rousing contempt, who does not engage in malicious speech. A person who does not relish pleasure, who is not arrogant, who is mild and of ready wit, who is not credulous, who by nothing is repelled. A person who does not take on the training in hopes of material gain, who is unperturbed if they get nothing, who is not hampered by wishes and not greedy for flavors. A person who is even-tempered, ever attentive, who does not suppose that in the world they are equal, superior, or inferior, who is free of conceit. A person for whom there are no tethers, who, knowing truth, is not tethered in any way, and in whom no wishes are found for existence or non-existence. This is someone I call peaceful. So something that's kind of striking to me about this description is that it kind of speaks in everyday language. I mean, we know what somebody's like who's angry, frightened, boastful, fretful. And he's saying it's not that. So he's speaking in everyday terms. He's not speaking in very esoteric terms. It's kind of a description of what it might be like to meet this person. You know, how we might find them if we met them and talked to them. So it's kind of an image or a picture of freedom from the outside in a way. There's a few things in here that go a little bit more into the inside of their mind, like ever attentive, does not suppose in the world they are equal, superior, or inferior. But there's a lot of it that's just kind of ordinary description, but framed in the negative. And that's the other notable thing for me about this teaching, is that it's a description of what somebody is not. It's what has fallen away and what we might experience in meeting somebody like that. You know, how we might feel in their presence. So I think in a way that teaching is a nice reminder that freedom can be felt, can be kind of touched into or tasted in a way in daily life, in our, you know, it can express itself in life. It's not just something that's in our minds. It's felt. It will be recognized. Somebody free will be recognized. I also think that the putting things in the negative like that, you know, saying what they're not, it leaves a lot of room for different expressions of freedom, for people to kind of manifest or express their kind of unique expression of being without craving. For some, that might look like being an activist. For others, it might look like being very secluded. So I think that that's another beautiful piece about this. When things fall away, there's a lot of room for different ways that people can behave. It doesn't say they will be, you know, they'll disappear and never be seen again by people. So to me, that's inspiring. You know, that's inspiring that there can be so many different expressions of freedom. And I've experienced people like that, different expressions of freedom, people I've met in the Sagaing Hills in Burma practicing. I got to meet several different monks living in the Sagaing Hills, and just such different ways of being. One was that very retiring, you know, quiet. He lived in this monastery that had a cave in it, and I walked into that monastery and it just felt so quiet. I just got the hit of the solitude, of the quietude of his mind by just walking into his monastery. And another monk was just so happy. You know, he was laughing all the time. He was very playful, and it's just very different feeling in these different beings. So that makes me happy. You know, what is our own expression of freedom? The Kalakarama Sutta is another teaching that describes freedom, but it describes it, I'd say it describes it more from the inside. It's a description the Buddha is kind of describing in a way. He's using words to describe what his mind is like, what it's like to be living in the mind of freedom with an awakened mind. And also in this sutta, describes what's not happening, which seems to be a theme, in terms of the description of awakening. The descriptions are what doesn't happen, not what's there, but what's not there, what's not happening. So what I'd like to do with this is, kind of maybe explore it in a slightly more reflective way. And so what I'd like to do is read this. I'll read it 3 times. The first time I'll just read it the first time. And what I'd like you to do is to just listen. I'm not going to put it on the screen so that you can follow it through. If you'd like to follow through reading it on the paper, that's okay. But what I kind of encourage is just to let the words land. They may not, there may be things that just don't make any sense. It may feel like there's pieces that just don't resonate at all. Just let those go. There may be other pieces that feel like there's some resonance, and maybe there's not even a sense of why it's resonant, but just let that resonate however it resonates. Almost like treat this like almost a koan, not trying to think it through or figure it out, but feel how it lands as you hear it. So that's the first time I'll go through it is that way. The second time I'll go through it, we'll go through it kind of more slowly. I'll go through it talking about my own reflections, how I've understood it, how it's landed for me, kind of to unpack some of the meaning that I've understood, or kind of some of the things that I found useful and helpful in terms of reflecting about this teaching. And, that again, it can be a little bit reflective for you. Again, just taking it in, seeing what lands, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And then I'll read it again a third time, just after we've gone through it. We'll read it again a third time to just see maybe there's a little bit of a difference in how it lands for you after we've kind of gone through it and studied it a little bit. And then we'll have some time for some questions. So I'll start with reading it. I'm not going to read the whole sutta, just a couple of sections. Whatever is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, reached, sought after, examined by the mind, that I have directly known. It has been known by the Tathagata, but the Tathagata did not become subservient to it. That word Tathagata is how the Buddha refers to himself. I'm going to read that paragraph again with a slightly different translation. Whatever is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, attained, sought after, and pondered over by the mind, that do I know. Whatever is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, attained, sought after, and pondered over by the mind, all that has been fully understood and known to the Tathagata, but the Tathagata has not taken his stand on it. Thus, a Tathagata does not conceive of a visible thing as apart from sight, does not conceive of an unseen, does not conceive of a thing worth seeing, does not conceive about a seer. The Tathagata does not conceive of an audible thing as apart from hearing, does not conceive of an unheard, does not conceive of a thing worth hearing, does not conceive about a hearer. He does not conceive of a thing to be sensed apart from sensation, does not conceive of an unsensed, does not conceive of a thing worth sensing, does not conceive about one who senses. The Tathagata does not conceive of a cognizable thing as apart from cognition. He does not conceive of an uncognized. He does not conceive of a thing worth cognizing. He does not conceive about one who cognizes. So let's go through this. There's one word that makes its appearance over and over again, and that is conceiving. Does not conceive of a visible thing as apart from sight, does not conceive of an unseen, does not conceive of a thing worth seeing, does not conceive about a seer. The suttas describe conceiving as an activity related to selfing. And it is often connected in the suttas to a kind of comparing. The phrase that was, one of the phrases that was in the poem that I read, one does not suppose that in the world they are equal, superior, or inferior, who is free of conceit. That is the way, that is one of the kind of definitions or way conceiving or conceit is understood, that there's a kind of the relational comparing ourselves to others. Same, better than, less than. So that's a kind of a relational aspect to conceiving. There's also places where it speaks to a subtler process, a sense of I am, or me, things happening to me, that doesn't necessarily have that relationship to another person, but may have a relationship to something, and does in some ways have a relationship to something. Conceiving is closely connected to that activity of papancha that we spent quite a bit of time with in the first meeting when we talked about the Honeyball Sutta. And in fact, the commentaries trace both of them as springing from the same source. They say they both spring from craving, conceit, and views. So papancha, just as a little refresher, papancha is that process that springs off of perception, thinking, and it's this proliferation, this mental proliferation. It's often translated as mental proliferation, kind of the mind running amok, a lot of proliferation of thought. It might be one of the more gross or obvious kinds of flavors of papancha. But there are subtler flavors of papancha also that we unpacked during the last session a couple of weeks ago, the kind of way that papancha can be understood, not necessarily anything related to thought in particular, but more the sense of reification of our minds create, our minds, the processes of our minds of seeing, smelling, hearing, tasting, create a sight, a sound, a smell, a taste, a touch, and a mental object. And then the process of papancha is kind of like the reification or the objectification, the making that process into a thing. The sight is a sight that's a result of a process. A sight results from the process, and the process of seeing then experiences that sight. It's all just a process. But in that process, often what happens is there's this separation that happens, this reification, that there becomes something seen as a thing and one who's seeing it. So there's the process of papancha we can talk about is the thing making and the separation, the insertion of a process of I or me in the whole process of sense is experience tumbling on. So I sometimes think about conceiving and papancha as being like two sides of the same process. Maybe conceiving being more the side of the process that's about, the creation, the mind's creation of the thing, the object, that believing that that sight is somehow standalone. It is a thing out there. There may be a thing out there, but what we are experiencing is not the thing out there. It is something in our minds. And what our minds have done is turned the thing that the thing that is created in our own minds into a thing, and kind of reified it into something that is other than that process. And in that process, it has also created the sense of I or me. So to me, the sense, the conceiving is that side of the process that is the I making, the self generation, the self making. So these two, I think of these two things as happening together. This conceiving being the process of inserting this sense of I, me, mine into our sense, the tumbling on of our sense experience. In another teaching, in the Majjhima Nikāya, this is in the first discourse in the Majjhima Nikāya, there's a section that describes a whole bunch of different ways the ordinary person relates to all kinds of different experiences. And there's one little piece of it, and for those of you who like the references, this is Majjhima 1, paragraphs 19 through 22. Describes in this way of seen, heard, sensed, cognized, how the ordinary person relates to experience. And it again brings in the conceiving, the notion of conceiving. So that one of those paragraphs, the one on seeing, for an ordinary person, one perceives the seen as the seen. Having perceived the seen as the seen, now see, one perceiving the seen as the seen sounds like what we're supposed to do in the Bahia Sutta, but it goes on to say what we typically do instead of just recognizing, oh, this is seeing. One perceives the seen as the seen. Having perceived the seen as the seen, one conceives oneself as the seen. One conceives oneself in the seen. One conceives oneself apart from the seen. One conceives the seen to be mine. One delights in the seen. Why is that? Because it has not been fully understood. So in a way, this brings in, again, kind of different, the conceiving here is bringing in different relationships of self to objects, to experience. I am this. I am in this. I am separate from this. This is mine. So in the Kalakarama Sutta, the Buddha's description of himself is that he does not do this. He does not, this conceiving process is not happening. And he goes about describing that with 4 slightly different kind of elaborations, let's say. So let's look at each of those. So the first one, the Tathagata does not conceive as a visible thing as apart from sight. And again, as I go through these and explore my own reflections on this, because I don't exactly know that I know what these mean. This is my own, this is all that it says. Does not conceive of as a visible thing as apart from sight. Now, there's some commentary about it, which I've read. There's all kinds of other things that I've read. So some of what I'm sharing comes from the blending of what I've read and studied, as well as my own kind of how it's landed for me. And, I think that's a lot with a teaching like this. Trying to think through it is not probably going to get us very far. I mean, some of it might be helpful, but I think more this kind of almost letting it just be like a koan, like let it land and see what happens, see how it resonates as I kind of think about this and speak about this. So, Tathagata does not conceive of a visible thing as apart from sight. So that, to me, brings in the whole process nature of seeing that we were just talking about. There's seeing that happens. The eye informs, that's a process, and the sight arises. There's a recognition of the sight, of what it is. So there's a kind of a mental process of recognizing that happens. What might it be like in a mind that does not conceive of a visible thing as apart from sight? To me, it doesn't mean that sight doesn't happen. It doesn't mean that seeing process isn't happening. Seeing is happening. The sight that's seen is simply part of the process of seeing. In fact, the process of seeing makes the sight and then recognizes the process of seeing, then sees the sight. It's all a process of our bodies and minds doing their thing. The sight that's seen is not separate from this process of seeing. The process of seeing creates and knows the sight. So the recognition of the process nature, to me, this points to that the radical understanding that what we are experiencing is created by our minds. So not conceiving, not creating that sense of an object, a thing, and a self knowing that object, thing. Does not conceive of a visible thing as apart from sight. Does not conceive of a visible thing as separate from the process of seeing. It is just the process of seeing unfolding. The second one, Tathagata does not conceive of an unseen. Now that one is a little more, that one's a little harder for me. I mean, this one, the commentaries have an opinion about this that sounds a little odd to me. And the book that I first read this sutta in, studied the sutta in, The Magic of the Mind, that I talked about the first week, the person who wrote that book had some commentary about these teachings. And he also said that the way the commentaries talked about this seemed a little odd. So I felt fine kind of looking at exploring it in different ways than the commentaries exploring it. But the commentaries say that what this one means does not conceive of an unseen. What the commentaries say is that the Tathagata does not conceive that I am seeing something that the great mass of people do not see. So kind of like that to me brings in the whole notion of the superiority complex. I am seeing something that others do not see. But that seems like an odd way to put it, because it's talking about what the Tathagata sees that others don't see. So anyway, it just did something, didn't quite land right there for me. So I reflected on it myself, and what kind of landed for me, what kind of resonated for me is thinking of it as the flip side of not creating a visible thing apart from sight. So there's that notion of not creating the idea of something there. But like the understanding of everything that I'm experiencing is created in the mind. That the only thing that I experience is mind made, could lead to a view or an idea or a kind of conceiving that there is nothing out there upon which this construction is founded. Might lead to the idea that there's no objective reality out there. There's no reality, upon which these sites are based. It is all mind. Everything is mind. So that to me kind of resonates, that because there's some teachings in certain schools that talk about everything is mind made, that there is no objective reality. And for me, I do tend to think that I am actually talking to people. I mean, even though you're just little tiles on the screen, I think you're actually out there. So, I mean, all that I know of you is what is coming in through these senses, but I think you're out there. so it's like not creating an unseen, to me, kind of is like not creating a visible thing apart from sight, and also not creating that there's nothing out there. That to me is kind of the koan of these two together. But again, how does it land for you listening to that? Does not conceive of an unseen. Maybe it kind of just stops the mind to like not try to figure that out. Just let it in. Then does not conceive of a thing worth seeing. Does not like construct craving around the site. This one's to me is easier to land with. It's the thing worth seeing is where craving has entered in. It's like, yeah, I want to see that, or I want to hear that, or I want to sense that, or I want to know that. That's a big one. I want to know that. That comes in a lot. So again, I think that if we explore these almost as what the flip side is, it's like we probably can't make ourselves not feel like I want to know something, but we can recognize when wanting to know something is a happening, is an arising, and notice how that is experienced. Again, so really using the Bahia Sutta in that way. In the cognized is only the cognized. Wanting to know is a cognized phenomenon arising in the mind. And the last one, does not conceive of one who sees. And this is the real sense of self side of the whole process. Does not conceive of a me, essentially. So I'll go back through and read this again and just see how it lands. Maybe close your eyes and just take in the words. Whatsoever is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, attained, sought over, and pondered over by the mind, all that do I know. Whatsoever is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, attained, sought after, and pondered over by the mind, all that has been fully understood. All that is known to the Tathagata, but the Tathagata has not taken his stand on it. Thus, a Tathagata does not conceive of a visible thing as apart from sight, does not conceive of an unseen, does not conceive of a thing worth seeing, does not conceive about a seer. He does not conceive of an audible thing as apart from hearing, does not conceive of an unheard, does not conceive of a thing worth hearing, does not conceive about one who hears. A Tathagata does not conceive of a thing to be sensed as apart from sensation, does not conceive of an unsensed, does not conceive of a thing worth sensing, does not conceive about one who senses. He does not conceive of a cognizable thing apart from cognition, does not conceive of an uncognized, does not conceive of a thing worth cognizing, does not conceive about one who cognizes. So there's a little bit more to this sutta that I do want to talk about, but I want to leave a little space here right now for any reflections, comments, anything you were curious about in terms of, maybe something that you noticed or didn't notice in as we went through this teaching. Yeah, Mike.
So what came up for me about this, like, does not conceive of an unseen, was the idea that you see something and then the mind does not go on. Doesn't you see a flower? All right, I see a flower. Don't start thinking about all the other flowers it reminded you of, or the last time you saw this flower. You
That's a
don't.
nice way to look at it. All the unseen flowers that are not being seen now.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, again, that's a beautiful kind of pointing what came up for you. So yeah, thank you for that one. Do you want to say anything more about it?
Does not conceive of doesn't go into, well, this is a pretty flower or this is an ugly flower. It's just a flower. Does not conceive about a seer. It's not my flower. It's just a flower.
And actually even deeper than that is it's just seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Joyce.
Well, where my mind went was, could this be imagination? And something like you're anticipating something. I don't know why I keep thinking about going to Yosemite, but that's what I'm thinking of. So you think about, I'm going to see Half Dome. But you don't do that if you're the Tathagata.
Yes, that's truth. That is kind of the mind doesn't go into the future or the past or create I think there's the capacity to think about the future. I mean, I think we have to have that capacity to live our lives. But the use of the word imagining is interesting because that is how Jnanananda translates conceiving, is imagining.
Oh, interesting.
So he says there's a paragraph that he translates that talks about a whole bunch of different ways of conceiving. And typically conceiving is the word that's used there, but he uses imagining. And so I'll read this paragraph, which gives a little bit of the flavor of thinking about it as imagining rather than, using the word conceiving. So he says, I am is an imagining. This I am is an imagining. I shall be is an imagining. I shall not be is an imagining. I shall be one with form is an imagining. I shall be formless is an imagining. I shall be percipient is an imagining. I shall be non-percipient is an imagining. I shall be neither percipient nor non-percipient is imagining. Imagining is a disease. Imagining is an abscess. Imagining is a barb. Therefore, you should tell yourselves, we shall dwell with a mind free from imaginings. Thus, you should train yourself. So here again, he's tying it to this process of I aming. And I think we can think without inserting the process of selfing. But I think it's very evocative. Imagining is very evocative way to think about what's going on when there is this, because it's our minds have created some world that's created a whole different world or perspective. And when we think about like going to Yosemite, it's like we're almost living in that world. We've driven up there. We're like looking at Half Dome. There we are. Yeah.
The other aspect was I did a meditation course on awareness, and we talked a lot about like the mind being empty. And so I think it kind of points to that too, is that the mind is empty.
Well, that's another way to look at the understanding of not self is the understanding of emptiness. In fact, that's how the Buddha defined emptiness. When asked, what is it empty of? The Buddha said it's empty of self and what belongs to self. So the sense of emptiness in the Theravada, at least, is directly tied to not self. And essentially, I think, recognizing that the unfolding processes of tumbling on of body and mind are just happening. There's not anyone here doing it. They're empty of me, like being in charge. And so that's another way to understand emptiness, is just like recognizing process as process. Yeah. Thank you. And Brooke.
Yeah, it just strikes me how consistent this view is, his description, with modern science, and that we see something, it's photons bouncing off of an object that enter our retina, and then that is actually flipped upside down and projected to our visual cortex, which then flips it right back side up, right side up again, and it's just the process of our visual cortex is what we actually experience.
And then the processes that go in there and identify what that was, it's all in there.
Yeah, it's just incredible that that it's so consistent with modern science, and modern science didn't exist.
I know, it's quite amazing. And I think sometimes I come back to the modern science definition of it to help me understand some of what he's saying, because it's like, yeah, I know from modern science that, the back of the retina, it's flipped upside down, and, somehow it gets into the visual cortex, and then it's kind of put together. And so I know from some of that yes, what is I am experiencing, it's all made in my mind. And I do think I do think there are photons bouncing off something out there. Yeah. Thank you. Augusta.
Thanks so much, Andrea. I feel like tonight I heard the word conceiving. I thought about conception and the creation of another being, right? Like this, like the birth of something, which I hadn't heard before in your offering of this, right? It's like, but I'm not creating something.
Yeah, I mean, conceiving is that, that conception. It's the birth of something. And, and we can think about that in terms of dependent origination, right? It actually talks about birth. There it is.
Yeah. Just like hadn't.
Yeah, it's great when
the word in that way.
A new resonance, right? A new kind of thing to just percolate, like let it percolate. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Stan.
I read a wonderful book called An Immense World. And in that book, they talked about the felt world of a whole series of different animals and how their minds and senses create that felt world that's there. And I think that's basically what we're talking about here, that there is this felt world that is created by all of the different resources that are there, and it's for the purpose of our surviving as an animal.
Yes. Yes.
Uh, what we're talking about is all the ways that get in the way of making that happening. And of course, we're so complex, and we evolved at a time when didn't have all this kind of stuff that we have now. Anyway, I just wanted to say.
Well, I would say it's not that our process of conceiving gets in the way of that process. Those processes go on. What I'd say is the process of conceiving is a misunderstanding of those processes. It's a putting something into that process that's not actually there.
Whether or not something exists in the outside makes no difference. Our world is there, and that's what he's talking about.
Well, I think in some ways, yeah, I agree. It makes a difference in terms of our ability to get along in the world. In some ways, but yeah, I mean, I think ultimately we have to navigate that we are, and I think this helps us explain and understand why there are so many different versions of reality, right? I mean, that we all have our own kind of way of taking in information. I think papancha really does explain so much of the problems we have in our world, because somebody takes information in and creates an idea based on that, and then sees the world further through that idea. Another person, a different idea gets created. They see the world through that idea. And, then, the idea becomes foremost and not what's actually being experienced. So, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the reason why we suffer.
Yeah, isn't it fun?
Oh, thank you, Stan. Yeah, so I'd like to continue. There's some more of this sutta. Some more parts of the sutta to kind of unpack. Find my notes.
I don't know if you have time, Andrea, but there are also a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Voice.
Quickly look. Yeah, I'm not able to track the chat very well. Where does drive fit in? So, yeah, I mean, the kind of motivation, impulse to do, there is activity. I mean, we often think about drive as related to craving, related to desire of wanting, and it often is. That's when that kind of sense of agency or sense of doing, the kind of action that springs up with unwholesome qualities of greed, aversion, or delusion, it will be a kind of a craving and unwholesome kind of action. But that kind of action can spring up related to wholesome motivations as well. So compassion, for instance, wants to act to alleviate suffering in the world. So there's a motivation in compassion itself that wants to support the ending of suffering. So compassion wants to act in the world. So we could say that compassion has a drive. I would call it more of a motivation, or of a aspiration, a direction, and of an intention towards non-suffering. But so, I think the confusion is that the typically drive does get kind of tied up with habitually get tied up with greed, aversion, and delusion. And so we have to do a lot of kind of untangling those, seeing how those how the greed, aversion, and delusion are kind of motivating that movement to do. And as the greed, aversion, and delusion fall away, I mean, greed, aversion, and delusion have had such a hold in our minds for so long that they cannot conceive that there's any other reason why we would act. You know, greed has in its mind that I am the best reason to act. You know, fear has in its mind, if you didn't have me in my mind, you would not do something to take care of yourself. You know, it's like those mind states believe they have our best interests at heart. And, you know, they think that we're not going to do anything unless they are there. You know, so those mind states believe they are necessary. They cannot fathom what might happen if they disappeared. But what happens when they disappear is that wholesome qualities of love, of compassion, of equanimity, of joy, of patience, of care and concern arise. You know, we don't become non-active, non-functional lumps on a log when greed, aversion, and delusion fall away. But greed, aversion, and delusion can't fathom what it would be like without them. So they keep getting in there and saying, you're in trouble if you don't have me. You're in trouble if I'm not there. So it takes some trust to explore what it might mean to not act out of those motivations. You know, it's a real exploration of trust. There's a lot more to say about that, but I want to continue with a couple more phrases in this sutta. There's two more phrases that I really want to unpack. So the very first paragraph that I read, I'll read it again. Whatsoever is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, attained, sought after, and pondered over by the mind, that I have fully understood. All that is fully known to the Tathagata, but the Tathagata has not taken a stand on it. So not taken a stand. What does that mean, to not take a stand on what is seen, heard, sensed, cognized? I think we can, you know, first reflect in the basic way about this means non-craving, non-clinging, non-conceiving, because that's the way the direction this sutta is headed, not attaching to views about that kind of thing. But in my reflection on this, you know, this not taking a stand has had really evocative, it's been very evocative for me, this idea of not taking a stand. So again, I'd like to kind of reflect on this from how it's informed my own experience, my own practice in a way, you know. To me, this not taking a stand has felt relevant in times where impermanence is very highlighted. So sometimes we can recognize that things are so ephemeral, they're changing so quickly that it doesn't feel like there is anywhere to land. There's nowhere to stand. Anytime there's a sense of standing, it's already vanishing, it's already ending, it's already fading away. And so that kind of that reflection has been relevant. And then the idea also is that whatever I feel like I could land on, there's this understanding that it's just my mind that's made it. You know, whatever I could land on, it's just mind made. And again, the impermanence, because, you know, it's just like blips and neurons in my mind. It's just brain waves. It's like, what is there to stand on? What is there to stand on? So that's one reflection. Another one is it's evocative of a sutta that this sutta came to my mind during one particular retreat, and it became my practice phrase, actually. Some of these phrases come back in my practice. They just arise in my mind while I'm practicing, and they become kind of informative of my practice. They affect how I meet experience with that wisdom that kind of penetrated in my mind. So this is a sutta, the first sutta in the Sutta Nipata. The very first one in that book. If you open it up, the very first teaching in that book, not the Sutta Nipata, the Samyutta Nikāya, the very first teaching in that book has this teaching about crossing a flood. A being comes to the Buddha and says, "How did you cross the flood?" Meaning this flood of greed, aversion, and delusion. How did you cross the flood of greed, aversion, and delusion? And the Buddha said, "By neither tarrying nor hurrying, I crossed the flood." And the person asked for a little elaboration and said, but how by neither tarrying nor hurrying did you cross the flood? And the Buddha said, well, when I tarried, I sank. When I hurried, I got swept away. So by neither tarrying nor hurrying, I crossed the flood. So that, to me, that neither tarrying nor hurrying, again, it gives that image of not standing. It's the image of just this and just this. It's kind of like, next things arising, but it's not the next thing. It's just this that's arising. It's just this. There's something replacing every moment. Tarrying would mean kind of like stopping and creating something to land on, right? Tarrying would mean that. Hurrying would mean thinking there's something better than this moment to get to, the next thing I need to get to, creating a thing about the next thing to do, the visit to Yosemite, whatever, just that sense of a next thing. And so by neither tarrying nor hurrying, just this, not taking a stand anywhere, just each moment, meeting each moment. It's like, to me, it created this image in my mind of like the Buddha walking on water, just this image of just meeting this moment. And then, before he has a chance to sink, it's the next moment. Before he gets swept, he's not going so fast, he gets swept away. It's just this moment, this moment, this moment. Another teaching that this one points to, and I'm giving you a lot of things that have been in my own practice evocative, a lot of pointings from suttas that have been meaningful in my own practice. There's another sutta that kind of entered in with this one to me. This is again in the Samyutta Nikāya 12:15. And the Buddha said, mostly, and I'm just going to paraphrase this, mostly people think about existence and non-existence. Things exist or they don't exist. And people are shackled by that. For most part, is shackled by the idea of clinging, the idea of existence and non-existence. And he says, but for one who sees the arising of the world as it really is with correct wisdom, there's no notion of non-existence in regard to the world. And for one who sees the cessation of the world as it is with correct wisdom, there is no notion of existence in regard to the world. Further down in that teaching, he says, for one who does not become engaged and cling through mental standpoint adherence, underlying tendency, does not take a stand about myself, this one has no perplexity or doubt that what arises is only unreliable experience arising, And what ceases is only unreliable experience ceasing. So it does not take a stand. What's arising is just unreliable experience arising. It's just impermanent experience arising, nothing to stand on. What's ceasing is just unreliable experience ceasing. Why stand on it? That kind of evoked for me in the thinking about the neither tarrying nor hurrying. Neither tarrying nor hurrying, I cross the flood. Why tarry? It's just unreliable experience. Why hurry? It's just unreliable experience that will be arising. Why tarry? Why hurry? Just this. Just this. So not taking a stand. The other word that comes at the end of the Kalakarama Sutta comes in a sentence that kind of follows all of the teaching that we've unpacked tonight. So follows does not conceive of a visible thing as apart from sight, does not conceive of an unseen, does not conceive of a thing worth seeing, does not conceive of a seer. The Tathagata, being such like in regard to all phenomenon, seen, heard, sensed, and cognized, is such. So that word such, I mean, what does this mean? What does this mean? The word such is a translation of the Pali tadi, spelled T, long A, D, long I. And other translations for this word are something like this or that. So it's a pretty simple word, this. The Tathagata, being such like in regard to all phenomena seen, heard, sensed, and cognized, is such. Just this. This is all there is. Nothing more than seeing, hearing, sensing, cognizing. Not conceiving in any way in relation to seen, heard, sensed, and cognized. The processes of seeing, hearing, sensing, and cognizing create and experience what is experienced. Nothing other than that. That's another way I think about this word. It's like nothing other than the processes. Such. Just that. Just this. The Tathagata being such like. The Tathagata being like this in regard to all phenomena seen, heard, sensed, and cognized is just this. Such. Nothing other than this. Nothing other than process. Now, what's interesting about this word is that sometimes this word is translated as stable. So Bhikkhu Bodhi translates this as stable. And his way of framing that sentence that I just read, being ever stable among these seen, heard, sensed, among things seen, heard, sensed, cognized, the Tathagata is a stable one. Now that's interesting to me to use that word. Jnanananda, in his exploration of this in the book, The Magic of the Mind, he says this: the quality of being tadi or such is often rendered by firmness, steadfastness, and immovability. And in fact, the word tadi is used in one sentence where the Buddha says that, a mountain is tadi. A mountain is stable, so that I think is where this notion of stable comes from. So we are not, there's a famous quote that's something like, just as a mountain remains unshaken by, a massive mountain remains unshaken by the wind and rain, so too the mind of one who's free is that way. So unshaken. So another way to put it is unshaken. So Jnanananda says, the quality of being tadi or such is often rendered by firmness, steadfastness, and immovability. Generally, one associates firmness, immovability, or stability with holding on or leaning on. But here we have just the contrary. Not to hold on to anything is to be such. This suchness has a flexibility of a higher order or an adaptability. So again, this kind of is a little bit of a koan for me. The Buddha has just said, he does not take a stand. Whatever is seen, heard, sensed, attained, cognized, pondered by the mind, the Tathagata has not taken a stand on it, and yet the Tathagata is stable. So those two together create an interesting kind of thing for me to reflect on. What does it mean to not take a stand and be stable? What is that? What is that? Feeling into that. What does that mean? We normally try to find stability by holding on to something, by landing on something. But we know, the teachings point to there is nowhere to land. If we try to land on things, it's already unstable. So the landing on things is inherently unstable. Taking a stand is unstable because everything is tottering. Everything is changing. The I is changing, forms are changing. Eye consciousness is changing, feeling is changing, perception is changing. Sounds are changing. The ear is changing, the hearing is changing, the feeling around hearing is changing. There's nothing that's stable in the experience, the world of our senses. And so trying to take a stand on what we typically think of means taking a stand, that's unstable because everything that's experienced is unstable. So the very alignment, this is what this evokes for me, is the very alignment of understanding that there is nowhere to land. There's nothing to take a stand on. That is the stability. It's an understanding that's the stability, not the stability that we usually think of. A mind that's aligned with the impermanent, unreliable nature of experience. So there's stability in non-clinging, stability in letting go. What does that feel like to ponder that? Stability in letting go. So different than our usual way of approaching the world. So, any other thoughts, comments to make about this part, about not taking a stand and such? Mary Lee.
Yes, as you've been exploring this, shall I say, it has occurred to me more with increasing clarity, that having an equanimous mind, more one cultivates and opens and experiences that, what follows is clarity.
Mhm.
And these,
And sometimes that clarity is also not what we think. I mean, we have ideas
No.
about what clarity is.
no, not an idea. No,
Yeah.
it's much more an intuitive, a revealing in a way. I mean, I don't like to use that word, but it is a different way of knowing.
Yes.
And the problem I bring to this my intellectual training. A lot of reading in philosophy. Oh, but so it's the mind, the intellect, that wants to poke and push and find the contradiction and where the place to stand evaporate. I mean, it's the mind state that gets us into trouble.
Yes.
And throws us out of
mind states related to greed, aversion, and delusion.
Yeah, as it turns out. I hadn't even gotten that, but it's just I know that what I bring to this in terms of sort of finely tuned intellectual training, I can just set that aside because it's not really very helpful. I mean, it's helpful when you need it as a set of tools.
Yes.
That's my toolbox. But when we're talking about this, as you've been sort of elucidating, exploring this, it's become clearer and clearer to me that this is what we're asked to have, is a sense of trust and faith almost in a way of knowing that's achieved through having a very calm mind state. I mean, this has just kind of been this cloud of unknowing has become a cloud of knowing as you've been talking. So I thought I'd just share that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, we do have to enter through our intellect.
Yeah.
I mean, and yet there is a point where we do have to let it go. I sometimes talk about the teachings being like Dharma rain. It's like let the teachings fall. And, if you don't understand them, it's okay. What I've seen myself so often is that a teaching arises, a teacher says something. It's like, I think about it. I try to figure it out. And it's like, oh, okay, well, I don't know what that was, but, and then 2 years later, that teaching in that teacher's voice arises in my mind, and there's a different way of understanding it. So it's like it went in there. It needed a little bit of thinking about, and then it arose again at another time when there was a new way of receiving it and understanding it. So, I think about all of this as like Dharma rain, and it does take a trust.
It's like a vast gazillion piece puzzle. And the more you fiddle with it, you kind of start messing it up in a way. I mean, you have to fiddle with it some and use your intellect. But then, yes, there's this sense of trust. Okay, now I'm going to just sit with this. This is what it is, and be very patient. And that's what I meant by the clarity.
Yeah.
It's a process. It's a process. It's so, my Western mind just is going, huh? Yeah. What a goofy way to go about things. But actually, it seems to be very insightful. Anyhow, thank you.
Thank you. BJ.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, my question has two parts. The first is I would like to understand what is meant by cognition in this context, in this sutta, and then or cognizing something. And the second is, would the Tathagata have actually been incapable of, say, strategizing or thinking about what to do in the future, or is that only our interpretation of what is possible?
Well, I think, just to answer the second part quickly, it's very clear in the suttas, the Buddha is awakened and he is, deciding, it's time to go for alms round. I need to get some food. He's deciding to visit his family and stand in the battlefield to try to stop a water war. I mean, he's taking action. He's talking to kings about their strategies for, their kingdoms and having reasonable and hopefully supportive conversations for them. So he has that capacity to strategize, to think, to plan. But again, it's not coming from greed, aversion, and delusion. That's that difference. We think strategizing needs wanting. We think it, and again, wanting will tell you that strategizing needs me, but it's not. Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the Buddha's example is that yes, he can strategize. He can figure out when it's appropriate to give a teaching, when it's not appropriate to give a teaching, all of that. So cognized in the seen is only the seen, the heard's only the heard. So the Bihiya Sutta uses these four: seen, heard, sensed, cognized. This teaching uses these four: seen, heard, sensed, cognized. It's understood to be a simplification of the six sense bases. So seeing, hearing, the sensing is smelling, tasting, touching, and cognizing is the sense base of the mind and what goes on in the mind. And so that's cognized. It's the functioning of the mind. And so like, for instance, in seeing, we have the eye, we've got forms, we've got stuff out there, and we've got, the meeting of those two being the contact and the seeing. And then there's the consciousness that happens with that, which is the mind door, right? It is in the mind door. So the consciousness aspect of experience, the feeling aspect of experience, the perceiving aspect of experience, and the mental formation aspect of experience all fall within the realm of the cognized. So anything that arises in the mind, including the perceptions, the feelings, the thoughts, the emotions, mind states, all of that would be in the realm of the cognized. Yeah, so it's pretty big, pretty big container there. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, and Heidi, you did have your hand raised, but I see that you said you thought you had your question answered, but you okay with that? Okay, so yeah, we should probably end here. And I think VJ wanted